back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Okay, guys, tonight I want to talk about that controversy that broke out last week on Twitter with that interview that Tucker Carlson did with historian Daryl Cooper, which I've taken a pause to think about how that broke down, and I have some thoughts on it, some general thoughts on it. But first of all, I want to thank everybody recently that has subscribed to the channel. I know in my last cast that I did, I asked for you guys to spread the word around as I'm trying to build a channel, and I'm really thankful to a few of you that spread the word. Amanda Brent is new to the station here, to the channel here. I want to thank Will Thomas for the nice comment, for supporting me, as well as Bronx Cat, as well to Joan of the media, and of course the Dark Traveler. You guys are always great. There's a few others that are always on here as well. And I want to thank you all for spreading the word and getting me these subscribers. Now, guys, so Tucker did this interview last week and with historian Daryl Cooper, and effectively it set off Twitter. Now, I don't spend a whole lot of time on Twitter. Well, let me take that back. I've started to recently, and I think I'm starting to regret it. It is such a sewer hole, Twitter. And I can't make out who are real people, who are robots, and all that stuff that goes on in there. But I had a friend of mine encourage me to go on there. That's where a lot of stuff is happening. I spent about 3 or 4 days on there after the Daryl Cooper interview, and the entire platform just blew up with controversy. And of course, Daryl Cooper came out and took a different historical narrative on World War II, and basically saying effectively, and he said, I'm being hyperbolic here, that he believed that Winston Churchill was the real villain of World War II, and then he had some thoughts, some general thoughts on the Holocaust itself, basically saying that not everybody in the Holocaust died because of mass executions, but rather there was supply chain issues, and a lot of people died because of disease and starvation. And so this set off a narrative, because in our Western political discourse, World War II is a big event because it really launches us into the liberal world order that we're now living in. It gives us a very black and white view of history, and it justifies a lot of the foreign policy decisions that have been made over the past 70, 75 years by the liberal republics. And I believe this is where a lot of the problems come in terms of modernity and decision that we've made. And that's why I believe Western republics have made some terrible, terrible foreign policy decisions. And what really has been lost in all of this is the sort of the evolution of the all-out war theory, right? An all-out war theory that really didn't exist in the old world, but an all-out war theory in the modern world where people are just being murdered left and right, where liberal republics and their armies are annihilating civilian populations in sort of a, I guess, what do you want to call it, an extreme collateral damage argument. And these are the arguments we use ultimately in Iraq. It's arguments we use in the Middle East today. I think we're seeing some elements of that in the Israeli-Palestine conflict today with a disproportionate response over there. We've also seen it, saw it in World War II, right? And that was one of the things that Daryl Cooper brought up, was the metrics by which Winston Churchill sort of governed that war. He questions the metrics, okay? Let's put it that way, especially with the bombing of Dresden and purposely targeting civilian cities, civilian sites, women, children, things of that nature. Of course, we also have the Americans, right? We absolutely leveled Tokyo and then dropped the 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the question is, of course, who determines what just war theory, especially when civilians are involved? In the old world, where the church had a role, when nations went to war with one another, there was certain standards, right? The church would step in, especially when there were 2 Christian empires fighting each other. But here we don't have that because we don't have a moral arbiter of truth. And in the world of the Western liberal republics, it's war all out until absolute exhaustion and destruction. And so these are kind of the tenets that we deal with, trying to analyze history and try to bring it into proper perspective. What's fascinating to me about this discussion between Tucker and historian Daryl Cooper is I thought it was a really mild conversation, and for the most part, it was excellent. But Mr. Cooper doesn't take really all that big of a position difference than many of the historians that I have read, that I've discussed here, right? Pat Buchanan being one of them. Richard Lamb is another British historian that I like, that has questioned Churchill's role and how he handled that war. Who else do you have here? David Irving is another one, right? But of course, David Irving is dismissed because he's considered a Holocaust denier. And there's been a few others that have said, listen, Churchill was out for blood. He was out for revenge. And a lot of it was just simply supporting the historical dictates of British foreign policy. And that was to always challenge the strongest power in Europe. And so there's a moral quandary here, right? What do you do, if you're on a European continent that's divided by many different powers in there, and one power starts to rise bigger than the other, right? Do all the other ones collaborate together to suppress it? Because that was the British policy at the time, right? Going back even to before World War I. And in many ways, a lot of historians that I have read would argue that Britain started World War I and World War II in an attempt to make sure that there wasn't a greater power building, and that primarily being Germany at the time. But also, it was the British in their attempt to subvert the Tsar and the fear of a growing Russian influence before World War I that gave material support to the Red Army over the White Army in Russia, along with the Americans and the Japanese. And in many ways, you could argue, at least from my understanding, that the British and the Americans helped create the Bolshevik and the Bolshevik revolution that ensued, that brought, again, Marxism, communism to the front of the world right after World War I. And so, again, this policy of trying to maintain which power has too much power and colluding with the weaker powers to make sure that somebody didn't grow too strong, all the while the British Empire was able to protect, again, its shipping routes, because it managed this grand empire all over the world. Remember, the British Empire was that empire where the sun never went down on the empire itself. And in that way, whenever somebody rose, the British made sure that there was a collusion of sorts to suppress somebody from rising up. Now, we know that the Germans were very, very industrial people. They were really coming around. But in many ways, again, what happened with the lead up to World War I, ultimately, after the war leading to the Bolshevik Revolution, at the assistance of the British trying to maintain control of the empire, you got a situation where you have to ask some questions about this policy. We have the British that are starving out the Germans as we're going into World War I. That was an issue. The Germans were rising. Now, remember, the German and the British confrontation in lead up to World War I was really a family affair. They were cousins, right? The king, the Kaiser, and the King of England, they were cousins. But they say that, I think it was King Edward, if I'm not mistaken, looked down upon the Kaiser as a sort of a weakling cousin. And you had the Kaiser at the time, I believe it was Wilhelm, who always tried to get his cousin's approval in England. And it was kind of a sibling rivalry of sorts that went really bad. That's the interesting thing about it. Actually, I think everybody was related at the time. I believe Nicholas was related to them as well, too. That's the interesting thing about it. But the moment the Germans come into the forefront of the post-industrial revolutionary era, and they start building a manufacturing capacity that became the envy of Europe, the British were going to maintain, or the British were going to control that situation. They just were. And they were willing to push the world to war. That's why when Churchill gets into power by the late 30s, it's really not hard for me, because he's simply maintaining the policy that England had always carried against Germany. The only difference was, in many ways, the Versailles Treaty and the blockade in the post-World War era that starved, I believe, something like 2 to 3 million Germans to death, really is what brought Hitler to power in Germany in 1933. I think in many ways you could blame the British. You could also blame the Bolsheviks, because there was other issues going on as the Bolsheviks were invading into Germany, particularly Bavaria. Remember, they temporarily took over Bavaria for a while. I think they renamed it something like, I don't know, Social Republic of Bavaria, or the Socialist Republic of Bavaria. And then it was one of the leaders there, Hindenburg, who got his top military troops. They were called, I believe, the Steel Toes. They had to go in there and clean out sort of the Bavarian province from these revolutionaries and push them back. Well, they killed a lot of them, but had to push a lot of them back to the Soviet Union. I mean, Germany was a nation that was being invaded. And so there's a lot going on there. Remember, I think what you have to remember here, and nobody ever puts this in proper context, especially classical liberals, is what do you do when the Bolsheviks, who are an internationalist movement, are sending their military troops effectively, they're active as AKA military, people all through the Western European nations. This was happening in Italy. This was happening in Spain. It was happening in Portugal. It was happening in Austria. And guess what? It was happening in Germany too. I mean, this is very important to remember, right? I mean, compare it to America here, right? Compare it if we had an invading army coming in here. How would Americans react? How would the government react? Well, actually, with this current government, I don't know how we would react, to be honest with you. We may welcome them in, right? But, in Europe at the time, with strong nationalist movements that cared about culture and history and bloodline and everything that was important to them, they weren't going to tolerate an invasion of a bunch of Bolsheviks. Remember, it was in 1919, 3 years before Mussolini got into power, that he declared that there was a Russian army camped out in Italy. That's how bad this was, right? And remember who the fascists were. They were the military soldiers, the veterans, right? Called, as Mussolini would call them, the trenchocracy. They got back from the war in 1917. They're injured, they hurt, they fought a war, they got screwed in the negotiations afterwards by Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George, right? Italy didn't get everything that was promised. And all of a sudden now you have Bolsheviks running all over Italy, taking over towns and markets, manipulating, intimidating, killing people. And here comes a counter-nationalist movement to confront the Bolsheviks in Italy. And the king was losing control. And the king turned to Mussolini and the fascists to push them back out. This is a part of history nobody ever wants to mention, right? Because from our 2024 American liberal paradigm, freedom, liberty, let's fight in the battle arena of ideas, right? Right. But give me a historical example when classical liberals have ever pushed out communists. When have they ever fought communists and won? They never have. They never have. Because they don't even know the battlefield they're fighting on. That's why, when American liberals, American classical liberals and conservatives impugn American values on other nations, they get it completely wrong. And it's also why American foreign policy has been a disaster now for at least a century, if not a century and a quarter. Right? Where we simply, try to evoke our own values, American values and structures of governments on other nations and thinking, oh, it's going to be okay, right? We're Americans. We got freedom and liberty. We want to share our freedom and liberty and our economic prosperity with you. If you do it the way we do it, You're going to be free and have prosperity just like we have prosperity, right? But that's not how politics works, not how governance works. First of all, not everybody shares in the American values of this laissez-faire freedom, especially in terms of morality and culture. America never really had a culture. You could say it was Protestant early on, but that really disappeared as Protestantism began to break down, especially the online Protestants, right? And the moment that the churches are vanquished after the 14th Amendment, America loses all of its identity. Not that I don't think, with the 14th Amendment would have saved us long term, because of the nature of Protestantism is subjective theology leads to subjective morality, which leads to the breakdown of culture and society. I mean, you got to ask yourself, right? Name me the pagan civilization that Protestantism was able to turn around and build up some sort of a glorious Christian civilization, right? Where? Can you name me that pagan nation that it converted, or a pagan civilization that it converted? I can't. The Protestants simply borrowed from the Catholics and then proceeded to destroy what Catholics had transformed from paganism into this glorious, Christian Catholic civilization we call Christendom at one time. In fact, you could argue everything the Protestants touched, they've eventually destroyed, including America, right? Look at the Protestant Reformation Maginot Line, right? Whether it's, Northern Germany, Netherlands, the Scandinavian nations, England, all of its offshoots, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These are the most liberal nations on the face of the planet today. And they are the ones ushering in this extreme liberalism, woke liberalism, that's transforming the world into a hellhole today. These are Protestant nations. This is what Protestantism always turns into, some type of atheistic liberalism garbage that makes everybody miserable at the end of the day. When you say, well, Frank, what about the Catholic nations? Listen, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Austria, they were all bombed into submission and had liberalism infused on it after the war. It didn't capitulate. Go to those nations pre-World War II, before liberalism and communism colluded together to destroy those nations. Yeah, Italy and Spain, post-World War II, after liberalism and communism are sort of impugned and are running their course through those nations, yeah, they got problems, but it wasn't a byproduct of Catholicism breaking down. It's one of the issues why we have the struggles and the issues within the church today, because the church no longer had a temporal defender to protect it from this lootingness, right? This craziness we call liberal civilization. Got to understand there's a context here that's being missed. So, we get to Adolf Hitler. What do we say about Adolf Hitler at the end of the day? Listen, I'm not going to rehash what happened in the camps in Germany, right? I did another cast here where I've been reading E. Michael Jones' book, The Holocaust Narrative. He, along with others, say that there's some nuance as to what happened in the camps, okay? It wasn't just mass execution, while at the same time acknowledging there was some executions and there was some horrible things the Nazis did. But there's more nuance there, and I'll let somebody else discuss that, okay? Because it'll take too much away from this cast to get deep into that. But let me just acknowledge the Germans, the Nazis, did some terrible, terrible things to a lot of different people, including the Jews. And here on this show, I will condemn that. First and foremost, I will absolutely condemn it. I won't justify it. That being said, I hope we could find an equal condemnation for America's alliance with Uncle Joe, Joseph Stalin, because that too was a problem. Because Stalin and the Soviets wound up being even bigger mass murderers than the Nazis, which to me, in my mind, says, okay, what's going on in Eastern Europe? What's going on over there? Where it led to massive mass slaughter. There's got to be more to this that we have not been really taught about throughout history. But this is the bottom line, okay? Whatever you may think of Hitler and acknowledge that he was evil and did terrible things. Just like America joining Uncle Joe as an ally, just like Winston Churchill aligning himself with Uncle Joe as well, too, to accomplish their foreign policy sort of feats or goals that they were trying to accomplish to maintain control of Europe. You find allies in the strangest places. And sometimes you go to war with people you don't like, and sometimes you have to go to war with people that are not good people. Let's put it that way. World War II was a final death nail in the Catholic world, the old Catholic world. It was a final death nail within the realm of Christendom. Fascism, whatever you may think of it, right? Because our minds have been all just brainwashed. That same liberal order that just had an absolute eruption on Twitter and social media over the comments of historian Darrell Cooper, those same people just go batshit crazy when you give any alternatives. But here's the problem. Right? And there's a lot of geopolitics going on leading up to World War II. Mussolini was the first to condemn Hitler and the only one to condemn Hitler up until it all fell apart, up until the British pushed Mussolini away because of, again, governmental system biases, because at the time, democracy saw itself as morally superior to fascism, even though the Italians were okay with fascism. Oh, and not to mention that little scuffle down in Ethiopia where Mussolini was labeled as being a colonialist, but all the while, the British also had an interest there, and Mussolini beat them to the punch, and that's what really broke their balls down in Ethiopia. But I've done a cast on that, and I'll do more on Ethiopia because there's a lot of nuance there. But here's the bottom line. These Catholic nations were being attacked on all sides. Western Europe, Italy, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Austria. In the case of Germany, it's a little different because it's not truly a homogenous Catholic nation. It's really a 50-50 Catholic nation. And so there's other things going on in Germany. And I think a lot of the problems that Germany has is because of this split that goes back to the Protestant revolt. In Italy and Spain and Portugal and Austria, these are much more homogeneous Catholic nations, and they're much more stable in regards how they treat people with human dignity, because the church had a role and a say-so there, right? This is why Mussolini worked with the Pope. They butted heads oftentimes, but at the end of the day, they worked it out. There was a respect there. Franco was a devout Catholic. Salazar in Portugal, devout Catholic. Dollfuss in Austria, devout Catholic. But Hitler, while he referred to God a lot, I'm not buying that he was necessarily a devout Christian. But here's the bottom line. You got the Bolsheviks invading from the east. You got the Anglo republics of the West, America and Britain coming in, trying to get a foot in the door, particularly through banking and usury. Fascists push back against both ideas, but liberalism doesn't take no for an answer. And here's this German guy, this German leader, who has just built the biggest, strongest army in Europe. And guess what? He hates the Bolsheviks and he hates the liberal republics. What do you do if you're the other Catholic nations? You find allies in the strangest places. Just like Winston Churchill was waiting for the Americans or the Soviets to join him, or both of them to join him. It was an alliance of convenience. It was an alliance of survival. And see, this is what a lot of Americans, especially Protestant Americans, don't understand. because it was Victor Davis Hanson that came out afterwards critiquing Daryl Cooper. But Victor Davis Hanson is a Protestant. He's a classical liberal, right? Let's pick a few dates here. Hitler did this, Churchill did this. We got the timeline that perfectly matches how we can prove Hitler was the aggressor and Churchill was the man that stood up to darkness in the late dark of the night, kind of a thing, right? But what they never address is what happened with the rise of Bolshevism and the threat of Bolshevism and the influence of big usury money coming from the West. Because, see, classical liberals like Victor Davis Hanson, first and foremost, don't see the banking policies of the Anglo-Protestant nations as a problem. He doesn't see that as something of great immorality, right? The fascist nations, which were Catholic, that condemned usury going all the way back to the Middle Ages, said, wait a minute, we don't want to enslave our people to a banking system, especially a foreign banking system, right? And banking is never talked about as one of the sort of precursors to the war that led us to the war. So if Victor can't even see the basic premises of morality within how a Catholic nation wants to govern itself, how can Victor even have a proper and just understanding of what was going on in Western Europe? And what was his proposition to stop the spread of Bolshevism? What was it? And what about the British willingness to go to war to defend its own empire? These are all incontrovertible facts that you have to deal with. Even if you have your timeline that shows that Hitler was the aggressor, look, this is the moment of history where they were fighting back, right? This is the problem that classical liberals have with Mussolini in Italy. Say, oh, look at the fascists. They took the violence to the streets. Well, what were they supposed to do? Fight in the battle arena of ideas? The same thing that's destroying America today? The same stupid ideas that has led to conservatives losing time after time after time after time? You're being invaded by a foreign army. And those nations, which were homogenous in Catholic culture, decided to fight back. I'm not defending the Germans. What they did was terrible. I wish Hitler would have never rose to power, but it was what it was at the time. It was. It was the last nails in the coffin of Christendom. And those Catholic nations were fighting back, even as disordered as it was in Germany. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't know how this is a problem anymore. But then again, I don't expect classical liberals to know better, mainly because we've been fed a bunch of mythos and narratives to support the liberal order we have today. A fairy tale story about history that gives us the current world today, right? The liberal order that we're all living through. It's why we've had all these odd and strange wars. It's why America has been spread all over the world. It's why we're going bankrupt today. We're a nation that's $35 trillion in debt, fighting wars, and then we want to blame Social Security recipients who worked their entire lives and had their checks taken from them at the standpoint of a gun to their head by the decree of law. World War I and World War II were European affairs, and it just needed to be dealt with by Europeans. And here we are, 75 years, 80 years after the war. And look at the mess we're in. Look at the mess. The British drew the line at Poland. Poland was an ally. The British were going to take the entire world to war over Poland. And what happened after the war? Poland was conquered by the Soviet Union. Nothing changed. Why was that war fought? That's what I want to know. Well, Hitler wanted to conquer the world. Well, did he? I don't know if he did. I know he had problems in the East. I know he might have took on Joseph Stalin. And maybe without fighting a two-front war, maybe he beat Stalin. And maybe we don't have the problems that we have today in the West. We've been consumed by Marxism. That's the irony of it all. Listen, I've listened to Daryl Cooper. His history seems right on. A lot of people don't like it because we got the narratives we've been given by the liberal institutions, right? By the educational systems, by the universities, by the government, by Hollywood, right? But here's what I want to ask my classical liberal friends, and I'll end it with this, right? We're living in a time of great social programming, lies from every direction. All the institutions have been corrupted by liberalism and Marxism at the end of the day. Nobody trusts anybody anymore. We're being gaslighted everywhere at this point in history. And yet, from a classical liberal conservative perspective, we just trust all of this, with the exception of what we've been told about European history in the 1930s and 40s. That is 100% correct from the very same institutions that we now distrust. For some reason, they got that one right. They got that one right. Are you guys buying that? Are you guys buying that? I'm not. It's pick and choose history here, guys. From everything I've studied, Daryl Cooper seems like a very smart man. Very well spoken, very articulate, understands the period. I don't find any red flags with his reasoning. I know that upsets a lot of people. I respect that. But the hissy fit that was thrown on social media last week, to such a degree where we're not even allowed to discuss these things without being badgered and destroyed over our lives, where we can't have a dialogue. If truth is on your side, what's the problem with having a dialogue? But we can't. Notice how the first intrinsic judgment against Daryl Cooper was what? He was an anti-Semite and a Hitler apologist. He didn't do anything like that. None of it. In fact, even with this comment on Winston Churchill, he was saying, listen, I may be a little hyperbolic here, but I believe Churchill was the true villain. He preceded it with a caveat, say, listen, I'm just trying to point out, as bad as Hitler was, Churchill wasn't the best guy either. This guy was a real son of a bitch too. That's what he was basically saying here. If you actually listen to him, he's very well thought out, well reasoned. And if we stop with our knee-jerk reaction to defend the liberal order since the end of World War II, the mythos, the paradigm, everything that we need World War II to be to fit our current world today, you will see that there is a little bit of nuance to history. It's worth studying. And you know what? All the power to Mr. Cooper. His podcast, from what I understand, has increased his subscribership rate. All the power to Tucker for asking questions. And again, for all the ideas or all the talk about fighting in the battle arena of ideas, we do nothing but shut down ideas in America. We shut down the dialogue at the end of the day. If you discuss it within the framework of that liberal box, the framework of democratic liberalism, where there's a left and a right, I keep saying this, guys, within that liberal paradigm box, we have freedom to discuss some of those ideas. But anything that goes outside that paradigm box, that ideological box, in America, we really don't talk about those things. And the moment somebody brings it up, we try and shame them, right? So props to Tucker Carlson, props to historian Daryl Cooper. You can check out his website. He's over at a site called Substack, I believe it's what it's called. Martyr Made is the name of his channel. Martyr, right? Martyr Made, Made. and it is at let's see here. Substack, Substack, Substack. That's where his podcast is. He's got a free portion of it, another part of it, a paid portion of it. It's how he survives. It's an app that I just downloaded right on my phone. He speaks very well. He's very well researched, does a lot of great topics. I think you guys will enjoy him. So Daryl Cooper, historian. That's the World War II controversy that broke out. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.